If you were to unroll a maritime map from the early 15th century, you wouldn't just see landmasses and oceans. You would see a canvas of human anxiety. Where the known world ended, the margins were filled with terrifying things. Giant sea serpents crushing galleons, scaled leviathans, boiling waters. But by the time the 18th century arrived, the sea monsters had largely been scrubbed from the parchment. The age of superstition was giving way to the age of reason. Telescopes were being pointed at the stars, physics was being codified, and the great empires of Europe were realizing that a precise map was a weapon every bit as devastating as a broadside of cannons. Yet, for all this new intellectual rigor, the maps of the Pacific Ocean were still dominated by a ghost, a massive, looming phantom. The most brilliant minds in London and Paris looked at the globe and saw a problem of balance. They looked at the heavy landmasses of Europe, Asia, and the Americas in the Northern Hemisphere, and they deduced with absolute mathematical certainty that there simply had to be an equally massive continent in the south. Otherwise, they argued, the Earth would be top-heavy. It would literally tip over and spin out of control in the void of space. They called this theoretical counterbalance Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. This wasn't a fairy tale whispered by drunk sailors in a tavern. This was established, peer-reviewed scientific dogma. It would take a man of singular, almost unnatural focus to sail into the void and shatter that dogma forever. A man who would essentially redraw the dimensions of the human world. But here is the great paradox of James Cook. He was not a lord. He did not possess a pedigree from Oxford or Cambridge. He had no wealthy patrons at the royal court whispering his name into the ears of admirals. The man who would eventually claim half the Pacific Ocean for the British Crown was born in a mud-drenched farming village in the north of England, the son of a day labourer. How does a boy who is statistically destined to die of back-breaking labour in a Yorkshire wheat field become the greatest navigator in human history? You see, his journey is not just a story of a man sailing ships. It is the story of human endurance, of the agonizing cost of progress, and of the profound clash between the empires of Europe and the ancient complex civilizations of the Pacific. In the hours ahead, we are going to follow this man across the entirety of the globe. We will stand with him in the freezing, bone-chilling rigging of the North Sea coal ships, where he first learned to read the water. We will glide in total silence down the treacherous St. Lawrence River in Canada, mapping a war zone in the dead of night, right beneath the cannons of the French military. We will feel the suffocating humidity of Tahitian beaches during a rare celestial alignment, and we will hear the terrifying groan of timber as his ship is pulverized by the coral jaws of the Great Barrier Reef. We will push further south than any human being had ever dared, staring up at the towering, crushing ice walls of the Antarctic. And ultimately, we will stand on the bloody sands of Kealakekwa Bay in Hawaii, where a fatal misunderstanding would end his life, yet spark a chain reaction that would brutally and irreversibly transform the world. It is a journey of spectacular triumph and devastating tragedy. But to understand the man who conquered the vast, open expanse of the Pacific, we must first look to the unforgiving, claustrophobic waters that forged him. It is October of 1728, in the village of Marton, North Yorkshire. The wind off the moors is biting, and the realities of life are brutally simple. You work the earth from the moment the sun breaches the horizon until the light fails, and if the harvest is poor, you starve. This is the world James Cook was born into, the second of 8 children to a Scottish farm labourer and his local wife. In this era, the class structure of Britain was not just a social ladder, it was an iron cage. Children inherited the exact dimensions of their parents' lives. There was no upward mobility. You were born into the dirt, and you returned to it. But there was an anomaly in young James's life. The man who employed his father noticed something unusual about the boy. He possessed an intense, quiet sharpness, an analytical mind trapped in a child's body. And so, the employer did something incredibly rare for the time. He paid for the boy to attend the local village school. It was a basic education reading, writing, and simple arithmetic. But for a boy of Cook's station, it was like being handed the keys to the universe. He learned to decode symbols on a page, a skill that the vast majority of his peers would never possess. By the age of 13, the farm life was put behind him. He was sent to work as an apprentice in a haberdashery in the coastal fishing village of Staithes. It was dry, safe, indoor work. He measured cloth, counted inventory, and organized the shelves. But Staithes was perched right on the edge of the brutal North Sea, and you can imagine the young man standing behind the counter, looking out the shop window. He didn't care about the ribbons or the wool. He was watching the chaotic ballet of the harbour. He smelled the rotting kelp and the sharp tang of salt. He heard the harsh, rhythmic chants of the dock workers, the snapping of canvas, the groaning of heavy timber. The ocean was a terrifying, violent place, but to Cook, it was a profound mystery waiting to be unravelled. At the age of 18, he made a decision that severed him from the safety of the land forever. With the blessing of his shopkeeper boss, who likely saw that the boy's heart was completely detached from the retail trade, Cook walked down to the docks and apprenticed himself to the merchant navy, specifically to the coal fleet. If you wanted to design a harsh, unforgiving school to forge a master mariner, you would invent the 18th century British coal trade. These ships, known as Whitby colliers, were the blue-collar workhorses of the empire. They were not sleek, beautiful vessels. They were blunt, wide, and flat-bottomed. But they were absolute marvels of practical engineering. Their flat bottoms allowed them to sail into incredibly shallow waters, and when the tide went out, they could sit perfectly upright on the mudflats to be loaded with coal, waiting for the water to return to lift them back up. The route they sailed down the eastern coast of England to London was notoriously deadly. The North Sea is a treacherous, unpredictable body of water. It is a maze of shifting sandbanks, hidden shoals, and sudden, violent gales that could rip a ship to splinters in a matter of hours. Every single year, the winter storms claimed dozens of ships and hundreds of lives. There was no margin for error. If you misjudged the tide, you grounded. If you misread the wind, you capsized. This was Cook's classroom. He spent years hauling freezing, heavy ropes with bleeding hands, climbing masts coated in ice, and shoveling filthy coal. But while other sailors spent their meagre wages on rum and distraction the moment they hit port, Cook did something deeply unusual. He bought books. After a grueling, back-breaking shift that would leave a normal man completely exhausted, Cook would retreat below decks, by the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle, surrounded by the stench of unwashed bodies and damp timber. He taught himself algebra. He studied geometry. He mastered spherical trigonometry and the complex mathematics of celestial navigation. Here is the contrast that defines the man. He was physically embedded in the most grueling, dirty labor the maritime world had to offer. Yet mentally, he was operating on the level of a university scholar. He didn't just want to know how to turn a ship's wheel. He wanted to understand the mathematical architecture of the globe he was sailing on. His competence was undeniable. Over the next decade, he rose through the ranks of the merchant fleet, transforming from a raw apprentice to a seasoned mate. He knew the tides, the lunar cycles, and the wind patterns with an almost unnatural intuition. By the time he was 26, the owners of the fleet offered him his own ship. They offered him a captaincy. For a farm boy from Yorkshire, this was the absolute summit. It meant respectable money, authority, and a secure life. He had won the game. But James Cook looked at the offer, looked at the ceiling of the merchant world, and he walked away. It is 1755, and Cook's decision to decline the captaincy of a merchant vessel left his peers utterly baffled. Instead of taking the helm of his own ship, he walked into a Royal Navy recruitment office and volunteered as an ordinary able seaman. He willingly stripped himself of his hard-earned rank and threw himself to the absolute bottom of the naval hierarchy. Why? Because James Cook possessed a rare kind of foresight. He understood that the merchant fleet, for all its steady income, was a closed loop. It was a life of ferrying coal from point A to point B, until you died. The Royal Navy, however, was the vanguard of the British Empire. It was where the world was being shaped. It was a risk of colossal proportions, but Cook believed that within the meritocratic, high-stakes environment of the military, his unique blend of practical seamanship and mathematical genius would eventually force the Admiralty to notice him, and he chose the perfect moment to gamble. Britain was locking horns with France in what we now call the 7 Years' War, a sprawling, global conflict that was essentially the first true world war. The Navy was bleeding men and desperate for competence. Cook's rise was meteoric. Within a month, he was promoted to master's mate. Within 2 years, he was a ship's master, responsible for the navigation and handling of a Royal Navy warship. But his true baptism by fire, the moment that permanently altered the trajectory of his life, occurred not on the open ocean, but in the freezing, turbulent waters of Canada. The year was 1759. The British military was attempting to strike a fatal blow against the French in North America by capturing the fortress city of Quebec. But there was a massive geographical problem. Quebec sat deep inland, protected by the St. Lawrence River. The river was a chaotic nightmare of submerged rocks, complex tidal currents, and hidden reefs. The French felt entirely secure because they firmly believed no massive British armada could possibly navigate the St. Lawrence without ripping their hulls open on the rocks. The British Admiralty needed a map, but you cannot simply sail a surveying ship down a river controlled by the enemy in broad daylight. This is where Cook's genius was weaponized. Under the cover of darkness, Cook and a small team would row out into the treacherous river. They wrapped their oars in cloth to muffle the sound of wood striking water. Operating in total silence, sometimes within musket range of French patrols on the shoreline, Cook would drop a lead line into the black water. He would measure the depth. He would take a bearing using the stars and the faint outlines of the shore. He would pull the line up, row a few yards and do it again, night after night, freezing and exhausted, knowing that a single cough or a clattered oar could bring down a hail of artillery fire. He took thousands of invisible data points and synthesized them into a masterwork of cartography. When the British fleet finally moved, they didn't hit a single rock. Guided entirely by Cook's meticulously crafted charts, the Armada glided silently up the St. Lawrence, completely bypassing the geographical defences the French had relied upon. The British troops disembarked, surprised the French forces, and Quebec fell. The map Cook drew in the dark had effectively won Canada for the British Empire. Word of this astonishing feat reached the highest echelons of the Admiralty in London. Suddenly, the name James Cook wasn't just another sailor on the roster, he was the Navy's premier problem solver. For the next 5 years, after the war ended, they sent him to map the jagged, convoluted coastline of Newfoundland. This was grueling, highly technical work. Cook introduced a level of scientific rigor to surveying that simply hadn't existed before. He didn't just sail past a coast and sketch its rough outline, which was the standard practice of the day. He utilized complex trigonometry. He dragged heavy surveying equipment onto land, established fixed baselines, and triangulated positions with the exactitude of a modern engineer. His charts of Newfoundland were so extraordinarily accurate that they remained in active use by sailors well into the 20th century. Cook had fused the gritty, intuitive survival skills of a North Sea coal sailor with the cold, hard precision of an Enlightenment scientist. And back in London, within the wood-panelled rooms of the Royal Society, the intellectual elite of Europe were facing a crisis. They had an incredibly ambitious scientific project looming on the horizon, one that required a ship to sail to the absolute ends of the earth. They needed a commander who wouldn't just survive the journey, but who possessed the intellectual capacity to work alongside the world's leading astronomers. They looked at the roster of aristocratic captains, and then they looked at the maps of Newfoundland. The stars, quite literally, were about to align for the son of a Yorkshire farmhand. It is the spring of 1768. The Royal Society in London, the absolute epicenter of the Enlightenment, is in a state of feverish anxiety. The greatest scientific minds of Europe are fixated on an event that will happen millions of miles away, an event so rare that no living human would ever see it twice. It is the transit of Venus. You see, astronomers knew that the planet Venus was going to pass directly between the Earth and the Sun, appearing as a tiny black dot gliding across the solar disk. If you could observe this crossing from widely separated points on the globe and time it down to the exact second, you could use trigonometry to calculate the absolute distance between the Earth and the Sun. And once you had that single foundational number, you could calculate the size of the entire solar system. It was the holy grail of 18th century science. But there was a catch. To get the necessary angles, one of the observation points had to be located in the uncharted, profoundly isolated waters of the South Pacific. They needed a ship. They needed a crew. And most importantly, they needed a commander who could navigate half the globe, keep a team of aristocratic scientists alive, set up a sophisticated astronomical observatory on a hostile shore, and bring the data back to London. They chose James Cook. When the Admiralty provided Cook with his vessel, they did not give him a sleek, majestic warship bristling with guns and draped in gold leaf. They gave him a ship called the Endeavour. It was a former Whitby collier, a coal ship. She was slow, she was heavy, and she had the aerodynamic profile of a wooden bathtub. But Cook knew exactly what the Admiralty was doing, and he approved. He knew that out in the vast, unforgiving void of the Pacific, speed was a luxury, survival was a necessity. The Endeavour's massive, cavernous hold could store provisions for 18 months. Her flat bottom meant that if she ran aground on an uncharted reef, she wouldn't immediately roll over and sink. She was a working-class ship for a working-class captain. And yet, the passenger list was anything but working class. Stepping onto the wooden deck was a man named Joseph Banks. Banks was 25 years old, fabulously wealthy, and brilliantly educated. He was a botanist who had personally financed a massive scientific entourage to accompany the voyage, bringing his own artists, assistants, and cutting-edge equipment. The contrast between the two men was stark. Banks was the epitome of aristocratic privilege, accustomed to deference and luxury. Cook was a stoic, weather-beaten sailor who had clawed his way up from the dirt. Yet, out on the open ocean, the two forged a powerful, highly effective partnership. On August 26, 1768, the Endeavour slipped her moorings and vanished into the Atlantic. Almost immediately, Cook initiated a war against an enemy far deadlier than any French frigate or Atlantic hurricane. He declared war on scurvy. For centuries, scurvy was the quiet monster resting in the dark corners of every long-haul voyage. It was a disease that caused a slow, agonizing unraveling of the human body. It was an accepted fact of maritime life that if you sailed for more than a few months, you would simply lose half your crew to the disease. But Cook refused to accept this. He approached the health of his men with the same cold, calculating logic he applied to his maps. He didn't know about vitamin C, no one did, but he had observed that fresh food seemed to keep the rot at bay. He imposed draconian laws regarding hygiene and diet. He forced his men to scrub the decks with vinegar, to ventilate the damp lower decks, and most controversially, to eat massive quantities of sauerkraut and citrus. The crew, accustomed to salted beef and hardtack, despised it. They mocked the sour, fermented cabbage. They threatened to mutiny over their diets. But Cook was unrelenting. He would flog a man for refusing his rations. He understood a fundamental truth that his sailors could not grasp. A strict, uncomfortable discipline was the only barrier between them and a miserable death. And he was right. While other captains routinely watched their crews rot away, Cook would sail around the world losing practically no one to the disease. It was a staggering medical triumph born of absolute authoritarian stubbornness. By June of 1769, the Endeavour had navigated the lethal, freezing storms of Cape Horn and pushed deep into the Pacific. They dropped anchor off the coast of Tahiti. If you want to understand what first contact truly means, you do not need to look to science fiction. You only need to look at the beaches of Tahiti in the 18th century. It was an overwhelming sensory collision. The British sailors, who had spent months trapped in a dark, damp wooden box, stepped onto a shore of warm sands, towering palms, and abundant fresh water. And waiting for them were the Tahitians, two entirely different branches of humanity, separated by tens of thousands of years of isolated development, staring at each other across the surf. The Tahitians welcomed the strange, pale men in their massive wooden island with intense curiosity. But the clash of values was immediate and profound. To the British, wealth was measured in gold, silver, and the accumulation of property. To the Tahitians, who lived in a paradise of abundant food where starvation was virtually unknown, European money was completely useless. But they saw the iron nails holding the British boats together. In a culture without metal, an iron nail was a technological miracle. It was a tool that could carve a canoe in hours instead of days. The Tahitians would trade anything, food, water, their own labor, for a single, rusted spike. Cook established a fortified camp, and the scientists set up their massive telescopes. On the day of the transit, the sky was perfectly clear. Banks and the astronomers tracked the tiny black shadow of Venus creeping across the boiling surface of the sun. But as they recorded their times, a creeping sense of dread set in. The intense glare of the sun interacting with the planet's atmosphere created a blurred edge, an optical illusion known as the black drop effect. Their timings were off by agonizing seconds. The data was flawed. The grand astronomical mission, the entire public reason for the voyage, was a partial failure. But James Cook did not panic, because James Cook had a secret. Once the astronomical observations were concluded, Cook retreated to his cabin and broke the wax seal on a set of highly classified orders from the British Admiralty. The transit of Venus was merely a convenient cover story. The true imperial purpose of the Endeavour expedition was now in his hands. He was ordered to sail south, deep into the uncharted latitudes, to find Terra Australis Incognita, and when he found it, he was to plant the British flag and claim the continent and all its unimaginable resources for King George III. The heavens had been measured, but the ocean was still a terrifying blank slate. He ordered the anchors weighed, turned the ship's heavy wooden bow away from the warmth of the islands, and sailed south, directly into the void. He sailed south for weeks. The tropical warmth of Tahiti faded into a bitter, biting chill. The ocean's swells grew massive, grey, and hostile. The men stood in the rigging, staring at the horizon until their eyes watered, searching for the towering mountain ranges of the great southern continent. But there was nothing, only endless, rolling water. Cook realised that the academics in London were wrong. If a massive continent existed, it wasn't here. It had to be pushed much further south, perhaps into the ice itself. But before he could chase the ice, he had another directive. He turned the ship westward, toward a jagged, mysterious coastline that a Dutch explorer named Abel Tasman had briefly glimpsed over a century earlier. A place called New Zealand. On October 7th, 1769, the lookout in the crow's nest screamed that he had spotted land. It was a moment of immense triumph, quickly followed by a heavy, suffocating anxiety. The land was real, but who inhabited it? And how would they react to a floating wooden fortress appearing off their shores? The answer came with tragic, blinding speed. The first encounter between Cook's men and the indigenous Maori people was a disaster of miscommunication. Cook rowed ashore with a small contingent, hoping to trade. He expected the welcoming curiosity he had found in Tahiti. But the Maori were not the Tahitians. They were a fiercely proud, highly organized warrior culture governed by rigid concepts of honor, territory, and martial strength. To them, strangers appearing uninvited on their shores were a threat to be challenged, not guests to be welcomed. As the British boats approached, Maori warriors performed a haka, a terrifying ritualistic display of physical power and aggressive intent designed to test the courage of an opponent. The British sailors, entirely ignorant of the cultural nuance, panicked. When a Maori warrior made a sudden movement, A British musket fired. The crack of gunpowder echoed across the beach. A Maori man fell dead in the sand. Cook was absolutely devastated. He was a man of the Enlightenment who prided himself on reason and restraint. He had explicitly ordered his men not to use violence. Yet, within minutes of stepping onto the shore, blood had been spilled. It was a stark, brutal reminder of the immense cost of exploration. The expansion of European knowledge was fundamentally incompatible with the untouched isolation of the indigenous world. Despite the violence of the initial contact, Cook eventually managed a fragile, tense truce, aided by a Tahitian priest traveling with them who could partially understand the Maori language. For the next 6 months, Cook did what he did best. He mapped. He sailed the Endeavour around the entirety of the New Zealand coastline, battling fierce headwinds and treacherous currents. He definitively proved that New Zealand was not the tip of a massive southern continent, but rather two distinct large islands separated by a turbulent strait. He drafted thousands of miles of coastline with a terrifying mathematical precision. He recorded the towering forests, the volcanic peaks, and the complex, sophisticated society of the Maori. Having essentially solved the geographic puzzle of New Zealand, Cook turned westward again, aiming for the eastern coast of Australia, a coastline entirely unknown to Europe. In April 1770, he sighted land and claimed the territory for Britain, naming it New South Wales. But the eastern coast of Australia was hiding a weapon far more lethal than any human army. For weeks, the Endeavour crept slowly northward along the coast. What Cook didn't realise was that he was sailing into a trap. He was navigating inside the Great Barrier Reef, a colossal submerged labyrinth of razor-sharp coral. The channel of safe water was getting narrower and shallower by the day, until the ship was essentially surrounded by underwater stone. On the night of June 11th, under a clear sky, the sea suddenly tore into the ship. The impact was catastrophic. A sickening, deafening crunch of splintering oak echoed through the hull. The Endeavour had driven hard onto a coral pinnacle. She was pinned, grinding against the rock with every swell, and water was pouring in. Imagine the absolute terror of that moment. You are tens of thousands of miles from home, on an uncharted coast, in the dark, and your wooden sanctuary is filling with the ocean. If the ship goes down, you do not just drown, you vanish from history. No one will ever know where you died. Cook's reaction was ice cold. He didn't panic, he engineered. He immediately ordered the crew to lighten the ship. They hauled their massive cast-iron cannons up from the gun deck and hurled them into the black water. They threw over tons of stone ballast, barrels of decayed food, anything that weighed the ship down. They manned the hand pumps, working in exhausting, frantic shifts, the men crying in the dark as the water rose around their waists. When the high tide finally lifted the battered ship off the reef, the hole in the hull was fully exposed to the sea. She was sinking fast. But Cook executed a desperate maritime manoeuvre known as fothering. They took a heavy canvas sail, stitched it full of wool, oakum, and sheep dung from their livestock pens, and dragged it under the hull of the sinking ship. The pressure of the incoming ocean sucked the foul, heavy fabric directly into the jagged hole, acting as a massive makeshift bandage. It worked. The inflow slowed to a manageable trickle. They limped the dying ship to a nearby beach and spent 7 agonizing weeks rebuilding the hull from the inside out. They had survived the reef by the absolute skin of their teeth. But the great rule of contrasts dictates that survival in the wild often merely delays the inevitable. After repairing the ship, Cook managed to navigate out of the treacherous coral maze and sailed to Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, which was a bustling established colony of the Dutch East India Company. The crew celebrated. They had survived the unknown. They were back in the realm of European civilization. They could fix the ship properly, resupply, and head home. But Batavia was a death trap. The city was built on stagnant, mosquito-infested canals. It was an epicenter of malaria, dysentery, and tropical fever. The Endeavour's crew, whose immune systems had conquered scurvy and survived the brutal extremes of the Pacific, were utterly defenseless against the microscopic killers of the city. Within weeks, the ship became a floating hospital. Men who had laughed in the face of violent storms and Maori war parties began to wither and die in their hammocks. The great botanist Joseph Banks nearly perished. Over 30 men, a full third of the crew, were wiped out, not by the savage ocean, but by the foul water of a colonial port. Cook was gutted. He frantically pushed the repaired Endeavour back out to sea, but the diseases had already taken root. Men continued to drop dead on the long voyage across the Indian Ocean. When James Cook finally dropped anchor in England on July 12, 1771, he had been gone for nearly 3 years. He had brought back maps of such staggering precision that they redefined the globe. He brought back thousands of alien plant species and detailed anthropological accounts of cultures Europe could barely comprehend. He returned a hero, a man who had erased vast, terrifying blank spaces from the map. But in the drawing rooms of London, the academics looked at his flawless charts and shook their heads. The maps were brilliant, yes, but they hadn't found the great prize. The ghost of Terra Australis still haunted the minds of Europe's elite. They were convinced Cook simply hadn't sailed far enough south. Cook realized that surviving the Pacific wasn't enough. If he wanted to end the debate, he had to kill the myth for good. And to do that, he would have to sail directly into the ice. It is the summer of 1772. James Cook is 43 years old, an age when most men of his era, having survived the unimaginable horrors of a 3-year Pacific voyage, would gladly accept a comfortable desk job at the Greenwich Hospital and fade into a quiet, respectable retirement. The Royal Navy had promoted him. The scientific elite celebrated him. But London's intellectual obsession with the mythical southern continent had not died. The mapmakers and theorists simply moved the imaginary landmass further south, claiming it must be hidden behind the cold fogs of the deep latitudes. Cook realized that if he did not go back and definitively erase this phantom continent from the minds of men, someone else would try and likely die in the process. He demanded a second expedition, and this time he was not just taking a ship, he was taking a technological marvel. For centuries, navigators had a fatal mathematical problem. They could easily calculate their latitude, their position north or south of the equator, by measuring the angle of the sun or the North Star. But calculating longitude, their position east or west, was essentially impossible on a moving, rocking ship. Without longitude, you are functionally blind on the open ocean. You can only guess how far east or west you have sailed. This mathematical blind spot had caused countless ships to smash into unseen coastlines in the dark. But a British clockmaker named John Harrison had just invented something miraculous, a marine chronometer. It was an incredibly precise, intricate mechanical clock housed in a wooden box, designed specifically to keep perfect time, regardless of the violent pitching, rolling, or temperature changes of a ship at sea. By comparing the exact time in London on the chronometer with the local time determined by the sun, a navigator could finally, precisely calculate his longitude. Cook was given a copy of this device, known as K1, to test. It was the 18th century equivalent of being handed a prototype GPS system. With this masterpiece of engineering carefully secured in his cabin, Cook set sail with 2 converted coal ships, the Resolution and the Adventure. He pointed his flagship south, far past the comfortable trade winds, far past the islands of Tahiti, straight down toward the absolute bottom of the earth. By January of 1773, the ocean had transformed into an alien, terrifying landscape. The water turned a heavy, oily black. The air grew so intensely cold that the rigging froze into solid rods of iron-hard ice. Men had to violently smash the sails with wooden mallets just to fold the canvas. And then, out of the dense, freezing fog, the true monsters of the deep south appeared. Not sea serpents, icebergs. Imagine steering a heavy wooden sailing ship, a vessel that responds sluggishly to the wheel, even in the best of conditions, through a dark, heaving maze of floating ice mountains, some towering hundreds of feet into the air. A single collision would shatter the oak hull like an eggshell, sending the entire crew into water so cold it would stop a human heart in minutes. There would be no rescue. There was no one else on the planet who even knew where they were. The crew was utterly terrified. They begged Cook to turn back, convinced that if they went any further, the ship would simply be crushed between the shifting plates of pack ice. But Cook did not flinch. On January 17th, 1773, the Resolution crossed the Antarctic Circle. No human being in recorded history had ever gone this far south. For 3 grueling, mind-numbing years, Cook effectively circumnavigated the entire Antarctic region. He plunged into the ice fields, hit the impenetrable frozen barrier, retreated north to thaw out, and then violently drove the ship back south into a different section of the ice. He did this over and over, essentially drawing a massive, tight circle around the bottom of the globe. He never saw the actual landmass of Antarctica. The ice shelf was too thick to penetrate, but his geometric logic was flawless. He proved, with absolute mathematical certainty, that if a southern landmass did exist beneath the ice, it was locked in eternal winter. It was entirely unfit for human habitation, let alone the grand, sprawling, wealthy civilization the scholars in London had dreamed of. The myth of Terra Australis Incognita was dead. Cook had killed it with a clock, a wooden ship, and sheer, uncompromising willpower. And amid this grueling geographical triumph, Cook achieved an even greater medical miracle. Remember the great rule of contrasts. In an era where a fleet could lose half its sailors to the rotting horrors of scurvy, Cook sailed the Resolution through the most extreme, physically devastating environment on the planet for over 1,000 days, and he did not lose a single man to the disease. Not one. His fanatical enforcement of hygiene, fresh water, and dietary supplements completely eradicated the most prolific killer of the maritime world. When James Cook returned to England in 1775, he had logged over 70,000 miles. He had rewritten the fundamental understanding of human survival at sea. At 47 years old, he was indisputably the greatest navigator alive. He had nothing left to prove. He was finally given a prestigious, comfortable post, a portrait painted by the finest artists, and the deep respect of a nation. He could have safely retired in glory, spending his days by a warm fire with his wife and children. But there was one last mythical passage whispering his name, and it would demand everything he had left. If the southern continent was the great geographical myth of the lower hemisphere, the Northwest Passage was the holy grail of the North. For centuries, the British Empire had been obsessed with finding a navigable waterway across the top of North America, a maritime shortcut connecting the Atlantic Ocean directly to the Pacific. If such a passage existed, it would revolutionize global trade, allowing merchant fleets to reach the immense wealth of Asia without the agonizing, perilous journey all the way around the southern tip of Africa or South America. The British government was so desperate to find it that they offered a staggering reward of £20,000 to the man who could map it. The Admiralty began planning a massive new expedition. They needed a commander. They knew Cook was exhausted. They knew he had earned his rest. But they also knew there was only one man on Earth capable of executing the mission. They invited him to a dinner party. They casually laid out the plans for the Arctic voyage, and the trap snapped shut. The temptation to be the man who essentially mapped the entire perimeter of the globe was too much for his restless, analytical mind to resist. He resigned his comfortable retirement post and walked back down to the docks. In July of 1776, Cook took command of the Resolution once again, accompanied by a new ship, the Discovery. They sailed south, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and entered the vast Pacific for the third and final time. The plan was remarkably ambitious. They would sail north through the Pacific, hit the western coast of North America, and essentially trace the continent upward into the Arctic, searching for a doorway that led east. By January of 1778, they were sailing through the deep, isolated center of the northern Pacific. And there, rising out of the endless blue, Cook stumbled upon a sprawling archipelago. He called them the Sandwich Islands, after the First Lord of the Admiralty. Today, we know them as Hawaii. The arrival of the British ships in Hawaii is one of the most heavily analysed, complex, and ultimately tragic encounters in the history of human exploration. You have to understand the timing. Cook's towering, strange vessels, with their massive white sails, appeared off the coast precisely during the Makahiki, a sacred months-long Hawaiian festival dedicated to Lono, the god of agriculture, peace, and fertility. The Hawaiians looked at the ships, looked at the timing, and integrated this bizarre arrival into their profound religious cosmology. Cook was treated with a level of staggering veneration. He was essentially paraded ashore as an earthly manifestation of divine energy. Thousands of Hawaiians gathered, offering immense quantities of food, laying gifts at his feet, and performing intricate ceremonies. Cook, the pragmatic, logic-driven son of a farmhand, was deeply bewildered. He accepted the food and the hospitality, carefully recording the rituals in his journals, but he profoundly misunderstood his role in their world. He thought he was engaged in an enthusiastic trade negotiation. The Hawaiians believed they were participating in a sacred cosmic cycle. After resting and resupplying, Cook sailed away from Hawaii, pushing his ships far to the north, toward the freezing coastlines of modern-day Oregon, Alaska, and the Bering Strait. For months, he mapped the jagged, hostile shores of the North American Pacific. He met the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, master carvers and whale hunters, whose deep knowledge of their environment humbled the British sailors. Cook pushed the Resolution relentlessly upward, searching for the crack in the continent. But just as he had found in the extreme south, the extreme north was protected by a fortress of ice. In August of 1778, deep in the Chukchi Sea, a solid, towering wall of pack ice blocked their path. The wooden ships rammed against it, searching for a weakness, but the ice was absolute. The Northwest Passage, at least for a wooden sailing ship, was functionally impenetrable. Defeated, exhausted, and feeling the heavy weight of his 50 years, Cook made a fateful decision. Rather than wintering in the brutal, freezing damp of the northern coast, he ordered the ships to turn south. They would return to the warm, welcoming islands of Hawaii to repair their rigging and rest before trying the ice again the following year. It was a logical, practical naval decision. It was also a death sentence. When the Resolution and the Discovery dropped anchor in Kealakekua Bay in early 1779, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The sacred season of Lono, the god of peace, was over. The Hawaiian calendar had transitioned into the season of Ku, the god of war and politics. The sudden, unexpected return of the divine British ships shattered the fragile religious logic of the islanders. Gods do not return out of season. Gods do not have broken masts that need fixing. The tension in the bay grew heavy and suffocating. The boundless generosity of the previous visit evaporated, replaced by suspicion and localized friction. Minor thefts began to occur. A chisel was taken, then a pair of tongs, and then, on the night of February 13th, a heavy wooden cutter, a vital rowboat belonging to the Discovery, was stolen from its moorings. To a Royal Navy captain, the theft of a ship's boat is not a minor annoyance. It is a critical threat to the survival of the expedition. Cook's patience, worn thin by years of extreme stress, finally snapped. He decided to employ a heavy-handed tactic that he had used successfully on other islands. He would row ashore with a heavily armed detachment of Royal Marines, walk directly into the village, take the High Chief hostage, and hold him on the Resolution until the stolen boat was returned. On the morning of February 14th, Cook stepped onto the black volcanic sand of the beach. He marched to the chief's enclosure and demanded the man come with him. Initially, the chief agreed, but as they walked back toward the water's edge, a massive crowd of Hawaiians began to gather, thousands of them. Word had spread that the British were attempting to abduct their leader. The mood of the crowd darkened from curiosity to intense, focused hostility. Warriors began to arm themselves with heavy stone daggers and long wooden spears. They donned their thick, woven armor, A Hawaiian woman pleaded with the chief not to get into the British boat. The chief hesitated, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation, and sat down in the sand, refusing to move. Cook was completely surrounded. He was standing near the water's edge, a few dozen yards from his boats, with a handful of Marines facing a furious, armed multitude. Somewhere in the bay, a musket fired. A Hawaiian chief on the other side of the bay had been shot by British sailors enforcing a blockade. When the crowd on the beach heard the news, the tension instantly violently ruptured. A warrior lunged at Cook with a dagger. Cook fired his musket, but the heavy lead ball failed to penetrate the warrior's thick armor. The beach exploded into chaos. The Marines unleashed a volley of musket fire into the dense crowd, but before they could reload their weapons, the sheer mass of the Hawaiian warriors overwhelmed them. Cook realized the situation was entirely lost. He turned his back to the crowd, raising his hand to signal his boats to stop firing and pull in closer to the shore to evacuate the men. It was in that split second of turning away that the invincible captain fell. A heavy wooden club struck him violently on the back of the head. As he stumbled forward into the shallow surf, he was struck again. He fell face first into the warm water. The man who had survived the crushing ice of the Antarctic, the razor-sharp coral of the Great Barrier Reef, and the invisible plagues of Batavia, died violently in the shallows of a Pacific bay. He was 50 years old. 4 Marines died beside him in the surf. The rest of the crew, watching in absolute horror from the decks of the ships just yards away, could do nothing as the Hawaiians pulled Cook's body up onto the beach and into the hills. Cook's body was given to the sea a few days later, following complex Hawaiian religious rites and a tense negotiation for the return of his remains. The guns of the Resolution fired a mournful salute, the sound echoing off the volcanic cliffs. His physical journey was over, but the terrifying, indelible lines he had drawn upon the world's maps had survived, and those maps, meticulously crafted by the light of a candle, would soon unleash a devastating storm upon the very people who had watched him die. When the battered surviving ships of the expedition, the Resolution and the Discovery, finally limped back into the grey waters of the River Thames in October of 1780, they had been gone for over 4 years. They returned carrying immense, world-altering knowledge, but they also carried a ghost. The command had passed to Captain Charles Clark, who tragically died of tuberculosis in the freezing Bering Sea, and then finally to John Gore, who navigated the exhausted crews home. When they delivered the news of what had happened on the sands of Kealakekua Bay, the British nation went into a profound, collective mourning. The king wept. The Royal Society was stunned. But as the initial shock faded, the scholars and the admirals began to unroll the staggering volume of charts, journals, and botanical illustrations the ships had brought back. And it was here that the true, terrifying weight of James Cook's legacy began to settle upon the world. What had he actually done? You see, he did not discover Australia, or New Zealand, or Hawaii in any absolute sense. These massive lands had been discovered, populated, and intimately understood by complex civilizations thousands of years before the Roman Empire even existed. But Cook did something unprecedented in the European mind. He codified the Pacific. He took an ocean that covered 1/3 of the globe, a space previously filled with mythology, guesswork, and white voids, and he locked it into a rigid mathematical grid of latitude and longitude. His maps were of such agonizing, pinpoint accuracy that Allied submarine commanders were still referencing some of his coastal charts during the Second World War, nearly 2 centuries later. He proved that the great southern continent was an uninhabitable fortress of ice. He proved that the Northwest Passage was a frozen, impenetrable dead end. He radically transformed maritime health, proving that a crew could sail for years without rotting from scurvy if a captain enforced scientific discipline. But history is governed by the rule of contrasts, and the contrast here is perhaps one of the darkest in the human record. For the British Empire, Cook's maps were a triumph of the Enlightenment. They were the ultimate expression of human reason conquering the unknown. But for the indigenous peoples of the Pacific, those exact same maps were something entirely different. They were blueprints for an apocalypse. Cook was not a brutal, bloodthirsty conquistador. He actively despised unnecessary violence. He ordered his men to respect local customs, to trade fairly, and he often wrote in his journals with genuine awe about the sophistication of the cultures he encountered. But he was, fundamentally, the sharpest tool in the toolbox of a rapidly expanding, mercantilist empire. He could not control the forces he unleashed simply by drawing lines on a piece of paper. Once the Pacific was mapped, it was no longer a mystery, it was a destination. Following the invisible paths Cook carved through the water came the whalers, the traders, the missionaries, and the colonial governors. And they brought with them a biological payload that shattered the indigenous world. Diseases that European immune systems treated as minor childhood ailments, measles, influenza, smallpox, swept through the isolated islands like a firestorm. In some archipelagos, including the paradise of Tahiti that Cook had so carefully observed, up to 90% of the native population was entirely wiped out within a century of European contact. It was a demographic catastrophe of unimaginable scale, and the survival of the land was followed by the subjugation of the people. In Australia, the exact shores Cook had claimed for the Crown became the site of brutal penal colonies. The Aboriginal peoples, whose deep spiritual connection to the land spanned tens of thousands of years, were violently dispossessed, hunted, and pushed to the margins of a new, industrialised society. In New Zealand, the fierce Maori warriors fought devastating land wars against British troops, ultimately seeing their sovereignty swallowed by the imperial machine. The Enlightenment, for all its talk of universal brotherhood and scientific progress, had a devastatingly dark shadow. It sought to classify the natural world, and in doing so, it began to classify human beings into rigid hierarchies, usually placing the European civilization at the absolute pinnacle. Missionaries arrived on the islands Cook had mapped and systematically began to dismantle the ancient religions, banning the languages, the dances, and the traditions that Cook's own artists had so meticulously painted. In the decades following his death, the British Empire transformed James Cook into a mythological figure. They built him statues in London, in Sydney, in Christchurch. They named straits, craters on the moon, and entire archipelagos after him. He was held up as the ultimate symbol of British meritocracy, the inspiring moral tale of the poor farm boy who climbed to the stars through sheer, unyielding hard work. But this myth conveniently ignored the tragic reality of his own family. His wife, Elizabeth, whom he had married in London and loved deeply, had spent 18 years waiting for him to return from the sea. When he died, she put on the black mourning dress of a widow, and she never took it off. She lived for another 56 years, supported by a government pension, outliving not just her husband, but every single one of their 6 children. All of her sons who went to sea died in their youth. There was no grand, lasting Cook dynasty. There was only the map. Today, the perception of that map and the man who drew it is fracturing. In recent decades, modern historians and indigenous communities have begun to aggressively challenge the romanticized narrative of the great explorer. The statues of Cook that stand in colonial cities are frequently protested, debated, and sometimes vandalized. For many, he is no longer just a brilliant navigator, he is patient zero of a colonial infection. And as the perspective shifts, the spotlight of history has finally swung toward the people who were navigating the Pacific long before the Endeavour ever left port. Today, we understand that the Polynesian wayfinders were executing feats of maritime genius that rival anything the Royal Society ever produced. Without chronometers, without compasses, without sextants, these indigenous navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean. They read the subtle refraction of waves bouncing off distant islands. They tracked the flight paths of migratory birds. They memorized complex, 3-dimensional star compasses. They were not primitive people waiting to be discovered. They were masters of their environment. We cannot undraw the lines James Cook placed on the map. We cannot wind back the clock to the morning before his heavy anchor splashed into the pristine waters of Kealakekua Bay. The globalized, deeply interconnected world we live in today is the direct result of his obsession with the unknown. We are left only with the complex, painful, and awe-inspiring world he left behind. James Cook lived a remarkably short, blindingly intense life. In exactly 50 years, he travelled from the absolute bottom of the British class system to the absolute edges of the physical globe. When you look at his life, you are looking at the ultimate bridge between two eras of human history. Cook was born into a world of wooden sailing ships, reliant entirely on the wind, navigating by the stars in a manner that an ancient Roman or a Viking would have fundamentally understood. But he died just as the first sparks of the Industrial Revolution were catching fire in England. Within a generation of his death, the sails would be replaced by towering smokestacks. The wooden hulls would be replaced by riveted iron. The agonizing 3-year voyages would be compressed by the brutal efficiency of steam power, and the continents he had mapped would be stitched together by the instantaneous pulse of the telegraph wire. The British Empire he served would swell to control a quarter of the Earth's surface and a quarter of its population, fueled by the raw materials and strategic ports he had so carefully documented. He didn't live to see the steamships, the global wars, or the violent waves of decolonization that would eventually sweep across the lands he claimed, but he laid the foundation for all of it. Today, the era of grand geographic discovery is over. Our satellites have photographed every square inch of the planet's surface. We have mapped the ocean floor with sonar and tracked weather patterns from the vacuum of space. There are no more white voids on the map. But the fundamental human drive that pushed a Yorkshire farm boy to read spherical trigonometry by candlelight in the freezing belly of a coal ship has not vanished. It has merely changed its target. Today, we are launching probes into the crushing, lightless depths of the Marianas Trench. We are mapping the staggering complexity of the human genome. We are sending robotic rovers to roll across the red dust of Mars. And we are cautiously probing the boundaries of artificial intelligence. And as we stand on these new frontiers, we are haunted by the exact same questions that followed the resolution across the Pacific. Why do we go? Who will benefit from this knowledge? What are the unintended consequences of our curiosity? And who, ultimately, will be forced to pay the price for our progress? James Cook's story is a profound reminder that knowledge is never neutral. It is always political. It always carries weight. The act of discovery is inherently an act of disruption. It changes the observer, and it permanently alters the observed. You cannot separate Cook, the brilliant, meticulous scientist, from Cook, the agent of imperial expansion. They are the exact same man. To appreciate his genius without acknowledging the devastation that followed in his wake is to read only half the history book. To condemn him as a malicious villain without recognizing his extraordinary personal courage, his restraint, and his genuine desire to understand the world is to strip history of its humanity. We must hold both truths in our hands at the same time. History is not a simple fable of heroes and villains. It is a messy, beautiful, and terrifying tapestry of human beings making decisions in the dark, unable to see the massive waves those decisions will create in the centuries to come. When James Cook first went to sea, the maps of the world were bordered by terrifying mythical beasts, dragons, leviathans, things that go bump in the night. By the time he was buried in the warm waters of Hawaii, he had erased the dragons from the map. He proved that the monsters were not real, but the reality he uncovered, a globe populated by millions of complex, vulnerable human beings, all colliding in a rapidly shrinking world, was far more profound, far more challenging, and far more dangerous than any mythical beast could ever be. And that is a map we are still learning how to read.